As of this week, the manga of My Hero Academia is officially heading into a new arc. And while that brings with it a whole slew of exciting prospects and potential developments, I think it's appropriate to look back on the arc that just ended and appreciate just how good it was. So, liberate your hearts, take a seat, and join me in reviewing My Villain Academia. If there is one strength in MHA I would have to highlight in particular, it would be its incredible willingness to depict the societal consequences of a superpowered world in a surprisingly nuanced and multifaceted way. This started all the way back with Stain, which was the first arc to really focus and thematize the influence of society and the interaction between public opinion and commercialized heroism. This approach can be observed in almost every subsequent arc. The public defeat of All Might, the mundane despair of Gentle, the bombastic struggle of Endeavor. Each event in the story has either had a defined origin in or consequence for the society at large. And with My Villain Academia, Horikoshi finally decided to go all in on that concept. The first thing of note here is just how unorthodox this arc is handled. In a lot of shonen manga, and in Weekly Shonen Jump especially, the main cast is seen as a flagship for a series. Protagonists in particular are often the face of their respective stories, their image plastered all over the series. That's why removing the main cast from a Weekly Shonen Jump manga for 22 consecutive weeks is pretty unusual and already gives the arc a sense of novelty. This is further capitalized on by what the arc is actually about, and it starts with the title itself. This isn't just a somewhat weird arc of My Hero Academia, this is a full-on inversion of what this series is usually about, turning its focus completely on the villains. And this is something I massively appreciate. We get to see the rise and evolution of the main villainous force. In a lot of stories, the main villain will already be an incredibly powerful force when they enter the story. And that is not a bad idea at all, because it immediately builds an interesting power dynamic where we want to root for our as of yet underpowered hero to overcome the wall of villainy. However, it's clear that Horikoshi has different priorities here. Throughout most of the story, the League of Villains was rather, well, incompetent. They were a ragtag group of barely functional crooks whose main threat came from their shadowy leader, who left the story after Kamino. And while they did have moments of coordinated villainy, they were, by and large, vastly outclassed by the heroes at every turn. And this is seen pretty well in their poster boy and de facto leader, Tomura Shigaraki, an aimless, unmotivated man-child who is a far cry from the main antagonistic force he is supposed to be. But this was clearly the plan. Horikoshi wanted to specifically show the villains rise to the top, as a sort of inversion of the slow but steady crackdown of hero society. Similarly, he wanted Shigaraki to be a mirror of Deku, hence why he, just like our protagonist, starts out pretty underwhelming and develops both his personality and skills incrementally, almost like the percentages. And I really think that these ideas truly came together in My Villain Academia. We start the arc with a league stricken by poverty, at brink of collapse, now tasked with defeating an invincible monster as their only hope, Gigantomachia. And in the middle of that, they are thrown into a citywide skirmish with a vastly more organized force, the Meta-Human Liberation Army, the MLA, fighting for the liberation of meta abilities in the name of Destro, led by his descendant, Destro. This large conflict is used for three distinct purposes. For one, it further fleshes out hero society. The Death Note Co. is one example, but it goes deeper than that. MHA has a desire to show villainy as a consequence of societal structures. Most people aren't just villains for the sake of it, often they are pushed into it, either by society, by their nature, or their ambitions. This is present in the MLA, as their desire to liberate superpowers is a direct consequence of the heavy amount of regulation imposed onto their use. It is also present within the League, as the causes for the descent into villainy get explored. 2. It allows the League to grow in power, both through the quirk awakenings and through their eventual victory over the MLA. And lastly, 3. It develops and explores Shigaraki and the League as characters. delving into their past and personality. Those last 2 points are interconnected, as we get 3 separate occasions on which a quirk awakening is the result of a personal exploration. Twice, Toga and Shigaraki all get extended backstories, which then lead to them accepting/understanding something about themselves and accessing abilities they didn't know they had. I am gonna be honest, when this was first introduced, I was skeptical. The idea of conveniently awakening powers didn't quite sit right with me. However, on a reread with the full context, it actually makes more sense than I initially thought. When people are born with a quirk, they don't receive a pop-up telling them what it is, rather they have to discover it. And as is brought up in Season 1, often people don't quite understand their power until later in life, hence why the government allows people to legally change their registered quirk. With this in mind, Toga already becomes a lot more believable. Her quirk necessitates the consumption of blood, which is pretty disturbing. Thus, she probably didn't have much opportunity to experiment with it or push it. This means that her discovering a new facet of her power in a panicked state is not a huge stretch. Society just wouldn't have let her use her quirk and actually train and discover it. It's a similar problem as with Shinso, where the quirk gives people a preconceived notion about you and that can limit you. And in the case of Twice and Shigaraki, both of them power up their quirk in response of them coming to terms with who they are. Twice realizes that he is real and the original, causing him to be more daring and reckless, whereas Shigaraki remembers his past and accepts himself as a harbinger of destruction, finally unleashing the original might of his quirk that had remained locked behind his amnesia. Overall, I think this is a fairly interesting addition to the system of quirks. Until now, we saw how quirks could influence a person's mindset, as the ability you're born with inevitably changes the way the world sees you, thus influencing your emotional state. See Shinso. But now we know that it also works the other way around, with your mindset and emotional well-being being able to lock certain sub-abilities away and unlock them as well. This also ties into the idea of quirk evolution, of quirks becoming stronger as the world barrels towards the ominous point of quirk singularity, something that both the overall arc and the joint training arc already brought up. I think it's overall a nice way of fleshing out the system, and I'm excited to see what Horikoshi does next with it. But among all the fighting and powers, the real highlight of this arc is undoubtedly Shigaraki and his growth. His backstory is straight up the darkest shit MHA has ever shown, and it really paints the picture of a person who was doomed both by his birth and by society. At this point, Shigaraki definitely deserves his own video, so I'll save the deeper analysis for then, but for now, suffice to say he has become a top tier villain in my eyes at least. One thing I want to quickly talk about is the big twist of the arc, Redestro surrendering and giving Shigaraki command over his army. I have seen tensions. As to say, I've seen people complain about this turn of events, calling it stupid and contrived. And to be honest, I cannot agree with that. Let's put ourselves into Redestro's shoes for a moment. He is an idealist who has built an army on the foundation of absolute liberation, the idea of being able to use quirks free from any governmental restriction, societal stigmas, or personal limitations. As oppression continues, his power grows, as his quirk transforms stress into strength. He scouts out the League as a competitor who is getting too famous, someone who could steal the spotlight once Redestro makes his move. So he hatches a plan. Kill the League and use the incident as a tale of brave civilians using their quirks to defend themselves. A surefire plan. After all, it's just 6 crooks with known abilities against an entire city of quirked up fighters. Except, things don't go as planned. Abilities develop, commanders are slain, and Gigantomachia appears. But while Redestro deeply cares for the lives of his people, he pushes on, as it's still for the greater good, for the will of Destro. Except that his power starts shrinking, his stress starts decreasing. And the reason for that is that Shigaraki, in an ironic twist, has become the very embodiment of liberation. Unencumbered by doubts or restraints, he uses his quirk freely and openly, accepting who he was born as. And suddenly, Redestro isn't sacrificing his power and his people for Destro's goal. It dawns on him that he's fighting against what he should be fighting for, Shigaraki is the embodiment of his ideals. This is why his heart becomes at ease as he fights him. This is why his power starts shrinking. And this is why he realizes that further conflict would not only be catastrophical as Shigaraki's power grows and kills more people, but would also be pointless as they're kind of fighting for the same thing now. So, he cuts his losses and surrenders, seeing Shigaraki as the one to be truly liberated and to bring true liberation. Overall, I think it's a pretty smart way of both powering up Shigaraki and keeping the new characters in the story. The MLA and Ridestro are pretty interesting concepts, so it'd be a shame if they just left the story after one arc. In terms of story, it also makes sense. As we are quickly approaching the potential halfway point of the series, it's not unreasonable to want the main threat to finally crystallize. And thus, Shigaraki becomes a force to be reckoned with, just like any good villain will usually be. But because he entered the story as a weak man-child, this progression feels a lot more satisfying and interesting, at least in my opinion. It also creates an interesting push and pull power dynamic between him and Midoriya. After the 6th quirk reveal, Midoriya is on his way to becoming insanely powerful, outclassing Shigaraki by default. Or so we thought. Now, Shigaraki is the leader of a 100,000 people strong army and has the ability to flatten a city, while Deku can shoot puffs of smoke. Essentially, Horikoshi is setting this up to be a very continuous dynamic of the hero and the villain growing alongside each other to eventually clash, which I personally am really excited for. But before we go, I think it's also fair that I should mention the things I didn't like, of which there are 3. 1. I'm starting to get tired of a lot of MHA arcs just being one big fight. Pro Hero, Joint Training, MVA. Pretty often Horikoshi's arcs will just be one combat encounter, and while that can be a quick exciting high, I would prefer it if he would use a few different arc structures in the future. Maybe some that actually build towards a confrontation first, instead of consisting of just that confrontation. Too many arcs don't really feel like arcs as much as they just feel like one event, which is something I actually appreciated in the overall arc, where it was actually more of an investigation at first, with the first confrontation with smaller skirmishes before the final big fight of the arc happened. 2. While I don't fundamentally have any issues with quirk awakenings anymore, I still think that the way it's introduced with Toga is pretty clumsy. It's just not made clear enough what is actually happening. Curious saying her fear powered up her quirk is just too vague in all the wrong ways. Luckily, later context makes it all more stomachable, but I wish this moment were executed a bit better, and I hope that the eventual anime adaptation, because let's be honest, the anime adaptation is gonna reach this eventually, is gonna fix it. And 3, we got robbed of Dabi and Compress. These two stick out as being basically forgotten for a good chunk of this arc. Dabi does get a cool fight, and a few details about his quirk, you know, in case it wasn't obvious enough yet who he is, but it's just very little compared to what the others get. And Compress does literally nothing. And while obviously not all characters are gonna have the same shine all the time, for an arc focusing on the villains, leaving these two this wholly untouched is a tad disappointing. And I think this covers it all. In conclusion, I'd say My Villain Academia was an absolute success. It absolutely blew me away with its development of the characters, with its evolution of the societal aspects of MHA, and also because of the cool action, because I mean, I read shonen and I can appreciate some good action. So yeah, I would say it was a pretty great arc. What, you want a ranking? I'm kind of bad at these, but I think I'd put MVA along my top 3 arcs, together with Pro Hero and Culture Festival. I give it 9 chest-beating gorillas out of 10. Thanks for watching and take care. I'll see you all next time. Bye bye!